It's now time to welcome our third keynote speaker, David Haskell, to the stage. Welcome, David.
Thank you, Michael. It's a delight to be with you all.
I'm so excited to have you here. And David, you speak for the trees in many ways, so I'm really excited to give you a chance to be a part of this conference and the nature of our city. Let me start off and just ask you a question. I've been asking our different panelists or our keynotes thus far how their relationship with nature has changed in light of COVID-19 and the changes that are happening in this experience that we're all working our way through. So any thoughts from you on how things have changed or ways that things have stayed the same?
Yeah, I mean, of course, the pandemic is a great reminder of how we are all deeply interconnected now in a global sense, but also locally. And the well-being and the livelihood of each one of us depends on cooperative, collective action. And so there's an ecological lesson, of course, in this moment. I mean, for all of us, for me personally, I've been getting to know the streets around where I live on foot a lot more. Putting in a lot of miles on my shoes. So we'll soon be frequenting a shoe store. So much wear and tear on them. And really getting to, I mean, I thought I knew the neighborhood pretty well. But going out day after day in that sort of physically safe way to just walk the same streets over and over has really been a revelation about the trees and the birds, but also how people are interrelating with their surroundings. So that's become very important for me, as have the little dramas happening right around a small suburban house. The doves raising their young, and the magpies ate some of them, and then they re-nested, and now that the young have fledged, and even nature and connections in the kitchen. When I drink a cup of tea, for some reason, being just so separated from usual forms of social contact, I'm thinking about the soil that camellia plant grew in, and the camellia leaves became the tea, and the people who pick the tea leaves, and what's my relationship to them, and in what way can my everyday actions of eating become a way of connecting in a more wholesome way to other people and to the community of life beyond.
Yeah, you're reminding me of a story. My daughter discovered a baby cardinal that had fallen from a nest from a bush right outside our living room, and we returned that to the nest and saw that there was a nest that we didn't even know was there and wouldn't have noticed in a normal situation with the fast pace of life. And my daughter's efforts as an environmental champion turned into the subject of an article by a local environmental reporter for the Journal Constitution, Charles Seabrook.
Oh, so, that's great.
It's interesting how the hyper personal is becoming a very experience that's exciting to see. I'd like to segue now into talking a little bit about your background and using that as a context for your talk. You're a writer, a scientist, a sound recordist. You've written 2 highly acclaimed books, and you won't brag on these, so I'm going to do it for you. The Forest Unseen, which is where I first got to know you, and it was recommended to me from Linda DeSantis, who was at the time the board chair for Atlanta Audubon. That was a finalist for the 2013 Pulitzer Prize in nonfiction, among other honors. Your more recent book, The Song of Trees, was winner of the 2018 John Burroughs Medal and named one of the best science books of 2017 by Science Friday, among other honors. These are 2 very different books, and maybe you could share with us a little bit about how those might fit into the conversation here today.
Yes, well, thank you. Both books have found one similarity between the 2 is both take the approach of what could we learn, what can our curiosity and our minds learn by repeated attention to the same place over and over and over again, over hundreds of times. And in the first book, the subject of the book is 1 square meter of forest, a tiny little patch of forest about the size of a dining room table, close to Swanee, Tennessee. So sort of out in a rural area, an old-growth forest. And the book relates through my close observation over a year the stories of the various creatures in that place. But also, even though the human presence doesn't seem so obvious, that square meter is deeply connected to each of our lives. Every time we breathe in, we're connected to the forest, and much of our culture and well-being is associated with the forest, even if we don't live right in the middle of a forest. Right. The second book, I take that same approach of returning again and again, this time to individual trees. And many of those trees were in the heart of cities, one in Jerusalem, one in the middle of Manhattan, in Denver, and also some trees out in places where humans seem to have a smaller presence, although that's an illusion because there are people living in those forests too, in the Amazon and the boreal forest. And in each of those, I'm trying to discover, through close attention to the tree, the many interconnections and networked relationships that sustains the tree's life, but then also in many ways that are unseen, sustains our lives. So the book is about trees, but at least on the surface, but really it's about relationship, and particularly the relationship between humans and the rest of the community of life, seen through a dozen trees around the world.
Yeah. And I think that actually brings us to the situation now, as you mentioned, people getting to know the trees on their property, the place they're at through repeated observances, that your method seems like it's something that people can practice as they enjoy your work. So
absolutely. We're in that time. We need that particular attention to place.
Yes. So with that, I'd love to jump right into your talk because I want to come back and see what questions we have from the audience and to make use of our time on the back end of this. So again, I'll refer people to keep their questions coming in the chat and to put question in the front of that. With that, I give you David Haskell.
Thank you for that introduction. And I want to start by offering my thanks to Park Pride for the invitation to be part of this event, and in particular for drawing us together in this time of isolation and of national crisis. And connections among people is so important just at the best of times. And now at this time when we're in many ways separate from one another, I'm so grateful for the opportunity to share some of my work with you and to engage in some dialogue and Q&A at the end of the presentation and be part of this marvelous conference. So many, many thanks to Park Pride and many people who've made this wonderful event happen. My topic for today is going to be the connections between people and trees. And I'll suggest that our livelihood and the livelihood of trees are intimately interconnected and have been so for thousands of years, and hopefully will be so into the future. And I want to start with a question. And I encourage you to put your answers to the question, any thoughts, in the chat box that is live alongside with this presentation. And the question is a simple one. Thinking back just over today, in what ways have you connected to a tree, either through your senses, your mind, your body, your spirit? If you have any thoughts on that, please put them in the chat box, and we'll continue that dialogue at the end of the more formal part of the presentation. And I'll start things off with a particular example from just a few weeks ago. These are American basswood flowers. The most gorgeous aroma of any of the North American trees, I think. It was suffusing parks and forests and suburban areas just a few weeks ago, and I still remember it. This is a snapshot I took from a neighborhood where I am now, and that memory is still a source of delight to me. So that's one of the ways that I've connected to trees in the present moment. So from the present moment, we're going to go back in time now, a few thousand years. And to do that, I want to go first to the old city of Jerusalem. This is the Damascus Gate on the north side of the old city of Jerusalem. This gate leads into the old city, a place that's been there for thousands of years, of course, layered in all sorts of history. But look at the foreground here. There's an olive tree whose branches are reaching out across the plaza here. This photo was taken in midsummer, and so the olives are just tiny little fruits. Later in the autumn, they will mature into much fatter fruits full of nutritious oil. And this tree has been part of human civilization and human well-being in this region for millennia. To see that more clearly, we can go below the old city, and this is directly underneath the Damascus Gate. There are some excavations that have revealed Roman ruins. The city we see now is built on top of previous manifestations of Jerusalem. And this is an olive press, indicating to us that 2,000 years ago, people were pressing olives to get the oil from them in this very location. To go even further back in time, we can take a little side trip from Jerusalem to the Dead Sea. If you remember your Middle Eastern geography, Jerusalem sits on a mountain ridge just east of the Mediterranean Sea. If you go just a little further east than that, you reach the Dead Sea. And here I am standing on the shores of the Dead Sea in the West Bank, looking across to Jordan. And these are people enjoying their Heinekens and enjoying immersing themselves in this very saline inland sea. What interests me for the purpose of this talk is not so much the sea as what is underneath it. Year by year, sediment arrives in the Dead Sea, carried down by rivers, and dust and pollen from the air. And this forms the mud layer that accretes and layers up bit by bit by bit over time. And because the Dead Sea is now shrinking, we can actually see this in the shores around the Dead Sea. This is an area where each one of those levels represents a place where the sea used to be and it's gone down and down through time, because these days not much water is reaching the Dead Sea, and so it's shrinking and shrinking, and the projections are that it may disappear within a few decades unless the water supply changes. If we look into those mud layers, though, here's another view, and you can see the salty crust on the top of the mud. If we look inside those layers, the top layers are the most recent ones that were laid down. Then slightly, we go back a few centuries as we go deeper into the mud, and then deeper down all the way to mud that was laid down during the last ice age and before that. And by putting that mud under the microscope, you can see the vegetation that surrounded the Dead Sea, particularly the vegetation around Jerusalem, because the winds come from the east and blow pollen across onto the Dead Sea. You can track the history of vegetation through the record left in mud of pollen. And here is one of those pollen grains, magnified under an electron micrograph. And by counting up these different pollen grains, a pattern emerges. Over the last 8,000 years, whenever human civilization was thriving in this region, olive trees were also doing extremely well. So you can look at the archaeological record of when great human civilizations were present. Those are also the times where there's a lot of pollen showing up in the record that's left in the Dead Sea. In times when human civilization had fallen apart for whatever reason, whether it was war or drought, the pollen record goes away and olives also disappear. So there's been a deep relationship between people and trees in this region, stretching back for 8,000 years. And 8,000 years is when the olive was first domesticated. The olive tree has lived as a wild tree around the Mediterranean for hundreds of thousands of years. But just in the last 8,000 years, the olive has come into close association with people. And why is that? Well, here's olive oil, familiar from our kitchens. 1 cup of olive oil has as much calorific content as the same volume as red meat. And olives are a tree that will thrive in this Mediterranean climate, where sometimes it doesn't rain for months on end. So often the winters are quite rainy, and then the summers are very dry. Not many crop plants will thrive in that kind of environment. And the olive tree does. And so people discovered that they could gain sustenance from this challenging land by working with this tree. So the tree provided lots of benefits for people, and there was a reciprocity, because people then helped the tree by clearing competing vegetation. by suppressing fires, by building sophisticated irrigation systems, even thousands of years ago, to bring water to the fields where the olive trees were growing. So no wonder then that the religious symbolism of the region, of religions that are indigenous to this region, featured the olive right at the center as a symbol of peace, of course, the olive branch. But in our words and metaphors and symbols, the Christ is the anointed one, anointed not with canola oil or water, but with olive oil. Hanukkah, the festival of lights, the lamp of the olive, of an olive lamp burning olive oil that should have extinguished but didn't. It kept on burning. So this symbol of unending plenitude coming from the olive. And in Islam, God is compared to the light coming from an olive lamp. So the olives are right at the center because they were quite literally the life-giving plant of the region. And this relationship persists into the present moment in a couple of different ways. One is through rain-fed olive agriculture. Here's an ancient olive tree, probably 1,000 years old, maybe just 500 years old, a venerable and august member of life's community. And it is pruned yearly, its fruits are gathered, competing vegetation is removed, and it is fed only by water that comes from the sky. That's the more ancient way and the least technologically involved, the least expensive way of tending olive trees, still practiced over much of the Middle East. Then there are more industrialized technological ways. This is in northern Israel, varieties of olive that are extremely productive when grown on irrigated land. This is drip irrigation that was invented in Israel in cooperation with people from Australia, using wastewater in this case. So recycling water to produce food from the land. So this bond between people and trees that roots back 8,000 years is still present and sustaining life in this region to the present day. And the symbols, pick out a dollar bill here in the US, and there's olive branches in the eagle's fist. Those olive branches don't come so much from biblical imagery, but they come from the importance of the olive in Greek and Roman traditions. Only two things would break this bond between people and trees. One was war, and the other was extreme and extended drought. And when that bond between people and trees were broken, when people couldn't tend their lands or there was insufficient water, the trees weren't sustaining the people could no longer sustain the trees, and both disappear from the landscape. No more productive olives. The pollen in the Dead Sea is other plants. It's not olive plants at those times. And civilizations collapse, for example, at the end of the Bronze Age. So this example from the Middle East is replicated all around the world. The origins of civilizations is often associated with the benefits provided by trees. One more example, briefly, this one from Northern Europe. After the glaciers retreated from Northern Europe at the end of the last ice age, one of the first plants to return, one of the first woody plants to return, was the hazel tree that produces hazelnuts. And this tree arrived with the help of humans, because the first people to come back to Northern Europe after the ice age, after the glaciers retreated, the first people were feeding on the nuts of the hazel tree and were using the hazel wood as firewood. You go to Mesolithic campsites and small towns, the remains are just covered in broken up pieces of hazelnut shell and in pieces of charcoal from burning hazelwood. And this was a reciprocal relationship, because the people were deriving nutrients from this energy-dense food, the hazelnut. They were deriving warmth from the wood that they were burning. But the people also helped the tree by clearing out competing vegetation, and perhaps by bringing hazelnuts north with them as they colonized this rather bleak tundra-like landscape. And then there were other symbiotic partners involved as well. Jays and other birds helped carry the nuts from southern Europe up to the northern areas. And in the soil, this acidic, cold, very damp soil of the post Ice Age time. The soil had within it fungi that wrapped around the roots of each plant and helped the plant gain nutrients from this very challenging soil. So in a way, it's a four-way partnership between birds, fungi, trees, and humans. And that was the foundation for hundreds of years, of the first peoples to colonize parts of Northern Europe after the Ice Age. Now, these are stories from thousands of years ago. This relationship, this symbiotic relationship between people and trees continues to the present day. And I'll introduce you to a couple of examples from urban areas that I've studied for the last few years. The first is in Manhattan, a place where we might think there aren't too many trees and not too much connection between people and trees, but we'd be wrong. Here is a Callery pear, also known as a Bradford pear, planted in the Upper West Side in Manhattan. It's about 40 years old, and it was planted at the time when Bradford pears were particularly popular. And of course, now in the Southeast, we know that we shouldn't be planting Bradford pears because they get out of cultivation into natural areas and can be quite invasive. But this is a tree that was planted up in New York, and of course, it's not invading anything here because all the surroundings are asphalt and hard surfaces. I've returned to this particular individual tree over and over again for many years to observe how it interacts with people, how people are connected to it. So one of the ways is evident to the eye. Here is a swipe of a sponge across a windowsill taken from an apartment just a few blocks north of this tree. And what is all that sort of the blackness and the dirt on the sponge? Well, that is particulate pollution, pieces of soot and other little particles from diesel engines and from the furnaces of oil-fired apartment heating units that was in the air and then fell down onto the ground and the windowsills of the apartments all around. This is a problem, of course, in cities all across the world. We now know that particulate pollution, when it gets into our lungs, damages our lungs, but it also gets into our bloodstream and causes inflammation all around the body. So not a good thing for humans to be breathing. Well, it turns out that trees, by having these complex three-dimensional architectures covered in twigs and leaves, and even in the winter when there are no leaves, you've got a huge surface area of branches and twiglets and bark. The particulate pollution hits the tree and sticks. So the tree is like a big 24/7 air purifier. And that particulate pollution sticks to the tree, and then when it rains, it all washes down to the ground. And this is a picture of my hand on that tree after a fairly gentle rain. And what you're seeing, the marks on my hand, are all that soot and particulate pollution that was on the tree that had been captured by the tree, now running down in the water. And this is all pollution that if the tree had not been there, would likely be in somebody's lungs. So in the most intimate way possible, at the level of our cells and our blood, we are connected through every breath in the city to trees. How else does the tree connect to us? Well, we look up and our senses are delighted by the green. We get a little window into ecology through the aromas of trees and the sounds of leaves, part of nature brought into the city to remind us of our presence in the community of life. And people have shown that the more we can have through replicated studies, the more access you have to this sort of green space, the better your physical, but also your mental well-being. Trees in the city also change how people behave on the street. This is a photo taken in the early morning, so there are just a few people on the sidewalk. Most of the time, there's a great throng of people there, and you can't stop or you'll get mowed over by the rush of humanity coming down. But the tree provides a little place to step out of the flow. And the spot under that tree is a place where people gather and chat, or maybe take a little time to talk on the phone or read the newspaper. It diversifies the possibility of human interaction on the street. And I encourage you to do this in your own communities. Find a street that has a wide sidewalk, a busy sidewalk, that has no trees on it, and observe how people behave there compared to a similarly busy city street that is lined with trees. And I guarantee you, you will see more diverse forms of human interaction and a little more chilled out forms of human interaction in the place with trees. The trees also provide shade. In July and August, put a thermometer under this tree. It's 10 to 15 degrees cooler than the sidewalk or the street just a few steps away that's in full sun. So the tree is putting a cool hand on the fevered brow of the city. Well, and what's really remarkable is to come back at 2 o'clock in the morning. It's the middle of the night. And yet the sidewalk under the tree is still 10 degrees cooler than the sidewalk that had no shade from the tree. Why is that? The sidewalk absorbed all the sunshine and the heat during the day and it re-emits it at night. This is why cities are often 8 to 10 degrees hotter than their surrounding areas. It's because it's like someone left electric radiators running on every city street throughout, just leave them on all night. The trees, though, bring that down. And there's, depending on the estimate in New York City, it's either between 10 and $80 million in saved utility costs each year because trees are present. If you got rid of the trees, air conditioning costs would go up. Stormwater would actually flow more quickly as well. There'd be more stormwater problems and you need to pay to manage that. So there's a direct benefit to people's pocketbooks and to the quality of the air. Because if you save $10 million of air conditioning costs, that's electricity that did not have to be generated, coal or natural gas. It didn't need to be burned in order to generate it. So trees provide this very direct benefit in terms of saved utility costs. Trees also provide us a window into the rhythms of the seasons. This is another view of the tree in the springtime when the pear tree is in full bloom. You can see there's a magnolia tree there as well, just in the median in the center of the street there. For those of you who know New York, this is Broadway and 86th, the intersection there. There's a vendor who works at this street corner, and I've spoken to him over many years, and he is so cued in to when all the different plants bloom, when the trees emerge with their leaves. He knows the rhythms of the seasons better than many people I know who live in rural areas, because he's paying attention to these remarkable signals of seasonal rhythms and of the connectivity in the community of life that are present right there in the heart of the city. So we gain many benefits from trees, in whether they're on city streets or in parks. But there's a reciprocity here, just as there was with the olive trees in Jerusalem. We plant the trees, of course, but planting a tree is only the first step to actually getting a tree to grow in the city. If anonymous municipal workers plant a tree in New York and then leave it, and then come back 10 years later, there's like a 50-50 chance that that tree will still be alive. But if you plant that tree involving people from the neighborhood and put a little label on it with a name, and on the back of the label it says, please give me some water if it's a hot summer, don't let your dog poop here, please don't chain your bike to me, the probability of survival of that tree goes up to nearly 100%. So by giving trees our attention and care, by giving them personhood, if you like, within human social networks, we return the gift of life that they are giving to us in the city. Another example, this one from further west, is from a city park in Denver, Confluence Park, named for the junction of the South Platte River that we see here and Cherry Creek. The South Platte comes down from the Rocky Mountains. Cherry Creek runs from the plains and goes through most of rural Denver. This is a cottonwood tree in this park that a few years ago was a place nobody would go to hang out. It was a place that was very polluted, quite ugly, quite dangerous at night. And now it's a place where you invite kids who live in the city to come down and play in the water, to hang out with each other. These are some disabled kids who are having an opportunity to go paddling and go down some of those little whitewater rapids and so on, right in the heart of the city with rivers and trees and people from all walks of life gathered in this one place. Contrast that to what we see upstream on the South Platte River. So we're going to follow exactly this river all the way up into the Rocky Mountains, and we get into wilderness area in the national forest. And the only people that I've seen in my visits to the wilderness area are relatively wealthy and white. And mostly they're retired guys who are fly fishing. A few bird watchers like me and others. But this is a place where racial diversity is like not present, at least in my limited experience there. And why is that? Well, these are the people who can afford to take time off of work, who've got a reliable car, can get up in the mountains, spend a day there, and then drive on back down into Denver or the suburbs. The same is not true in the city here. You don't need to take a full day off work. You don't even need a car. There are plenty of public transit options that will bring you right to this park. So Confluence Park and the trees and rivers that people enjoy there are a meeting of people from many, many different walks of life. It's also a place where people can see some of the indigenous wildlife of the region. This is what happened to my cottonwood tree one winter. Beavers swam from up the South Platte River from some other urban areas where they've made some beaver lodges and chopped down the tree. Now the tree next year resprouted, and so everything is fine with my study of this tree. But you can see beavers and foxes and coyotes and bald eagles fly across this as they're flying down the South Platte River from one feeding area to another. And night herons, native insects and butterflies, and migrant birds. So the park is a place not only that's open to people from all different walks of life and is accessible regardless of income, but it's also a place where we can all connect to the broader community of life, namely other species that live in our region. So this is one of the great gifts that parks provide us. So what's the nature of the city in Atlanta? Well, as you're all familiar with, Atlanta is a very treed city. Denver has only 4% canopy cover. It was built on the shortgrass prairie, and every tree there, except for the cottonwoods along the river, has been planted and brought in. Atlanta, on the other hand, has well over 40% canopy. So within the US, the highest canopy cover of any major city. But Atlanta is also at a pivotal point in its history, in that we are now deciding what is the future of that canopy cover and who will get to benefit from it, because canopy cover is unevenly spread across the city. In the downtown area, not many trees at all. As you move out into neighborhoods, you see trees that are either sparsely covered or some places that edge up towards 40 or even 50% canopy cover. Now, being in a city that has a significant degree of canopy cover does not mean that you are guaranteed access to trees or to parks. 1/3 of people in Atlanta live where they don't have easy walking distance to a park. And so it's these statistics that indicate to us that access is unequal. And so I'm incredibly admiring of Park Pride's work in focusing their efforts across the socioeconomic spectrum in Atlanta and giving particular attention to helping people in lower income areas make sure that they too have access to the many benefits of parks and trees. Let me throw in one dimension about the future here that is particularly important, I think, in Atlanta. And that is days of extreme heat and what the role of increased temperatures will be in the future. So this is a projection, so it's uncertain. It's based on the best models we have now. It's been put together by the Union of Concerned Scientists. And the projection asks, how many days do we think will be above 105 degrees as their high temperature in the years to come? So 105 degrees Fahrenheit, pretty warm. Historically, of course, it goes up and down year by year. There's no sort of predictable number here. But on average, from the 1970s to 2000, it's about 1 day a year. Some years more, some less. Looking 30 years into the future, 23 days per year. And looking so any child who's been born now in 2020, when they're 50 years old, years old and older, it may be almost 2 months of the year are spent with temperatures above 105 degrees. Of course, this is a problem for public health. These are dangerous levels of heat, particularly when you're in a climate of very high humidity. So the union here says, well, with bold action, we could limit this to 13 days per year. And that bold action, of course, involves many different things, but trees are part of it. Because trees and parks sequester carbon, they draw it down from the atmosphere and store it in the soil and in their bodies. But especially and more important in the city, they mitigate these terribly hot days. The neighborhoods that have access to trees, have access to parks, will suffer much, much less, and people will be less sick, and there'll be fewer heat-related deaths in places where we have access to trees and parks. You know that 105 will be spread unevenly across Atlanta. So that one of the big ethical questions is, how do we plan for that future, for a future that's more equal in the access that we all have to good livelihoods and good life? So I come back to the question from the beginning. In what ways have we connected to trees today? And some of those are fairly obvious and delightful, that there's a tree growing outside your front door, maybe in the park down the road. Perhaps you thought of your coffee or your tea, which come from domesticated plants, or through palm oil or olive oil, again, connections to trees around the world. But many are unseen. Every breath of air that we take, we're connecting our lungs and the health of our lungs to the air, which is partly a product of how many trees are in our neighborhoods. When we pay a utility bill, we are partly connecting out to trees, because the amount of air conditioning we have to pay for depends on how many trees are in our neighborhood, and more generally in the region all around us. Trees also connect to our sense of physical and mental, spiritual well-being, because they open our senses into the possibility of the other and of interconnection with that other. So I've shared a few examples from different time periods and different areas to try to make the case that although we might think of ourselves as individuals, and trees are individuals, and we're in some ways separate, in fact, we're partly made from each other. The cells in my lungs are partly made from their connections with trees. My pocketbook, how much money or lack of money is in my pocketbook, is partly a result of how connected I am to trees in my neighborhood. And this is a general truth across all of biology now. We're discovering, say, the human body. Without the bacteria and fungi that grow on and in us, we'd be very sick. The same is true for trees. They have all sorts of other organisms living on and in their leaves. They are living communities. We are living communities. And this connection between people and trees is one extremely important way in which that connection unfolds in the present moment. And it's a place where we have agency. We have the ability to do this right. And in a city like Atlanta that has so much tree cover left, we have the opportunity not to make the mistakes that other cities did in, say, the 19th or 20th centuries, where they reserved parks and trees only for some neighborhoods and not for others. That's the opportunity that we can now seize now, so that people in 100 years will look back and say, thank goodness those people in the first part of the 20th century had the right idea and saw that human well-being and tree well-being were intimately connected. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, David. And I have to say that paying attention to the chat, you've really struck a chord with our audience with the question of, in what ways have you connected with a tree? I've so enjoyed seeing the responses from folks. I think you've got people thinking about trees in a different light. That was a great opener.
Yes, well, I mean, I'll mention one thing. For me, the aromas of trees have been just extraordinary. The last few years, I've been doing a little species by species comparison of the different aromatic signatures of trees. And it's been a wonderful way of opening myself to the sensory diversity, but then also my curiosity to asking, why is it? Why is it that this pine tree
Right.
smells different than this one?
Well, I think that the sensory elements of engaging folks makes an awful lot of sense. I'm curious, and I feel like there are ways that you are really trying to get people to change and to take a closer look at the world around them. And in there, we're trying to really change the conversation with people to think about trees in a different light. And I would love to get your thoughts on how we kind of use those kind of the things that have driven you in your writing to think about how we expand the conversation and we get folks to engage more broadly than perhaps those that are paying attention right now.
Yeah, so trees have this important symbolic role in our culture. There's the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Whenever there's a story about meaning and origins, often there's a tree involved in that. So we have this. It's almost like a cultural subconscious understanding that trees are part of the origin of life. So for me, part of the work, I think, is reminding people that these are not just metaphors, that this is a lived reality, and that the tree, because it's on the scale that we can relate to, it's larger than our own human bodies, is in a way draws us out of ourselves more effectively, say, than just like a little insect or talking about fungi in the ground and the soil and so on.
Yeah.
It's something we can really relate to. So we've got a lot of cultural metaphor, and we've got the potential for this unselfing into the lives of others. And I think bringing both of those to bear, depending on the context and the audience and so on, can be quite powerful in a way of getting people to, I should pay attention to that tree in my neighborhood and see where it leads. And I love the open-ended nature of those interactions as well. What is true for me may be very different interaction for someone else. Honoring those differences, I think, is very important.
Yes. Your talk was really began with the idea of looking at the connections between trees and people. There's a question that Zach asks: in what ways do urban trees allow for more diverse forms of human interaction with the natural community, insects and birds? Do you see ripple effect of nature? So trees being almost that gateway into a greater sense of appreciation for nature, perhaps.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, trees are the gateway drug. Birds are too, into interaction with the broader community of life. For people, and the main missing ingredient often is just our attention. If we just give them our attention, things open up. But there's also an important way in which trees are the foundation of the food web in many places. So an oak tree, Doug Tellme and others have done marvelous work showing how a single oak tree can host hundreds of different species of insect. So without the trees, we don't have the rest of that community of life. This is particularly important in urban areas. So there's a reciprocity there. The tree makes possible a broader ecological living community, and also invites us into relationship with it.
I completely agree. I've got time for one last question, and this one was something that was raised by Ravonda Cosby as well as Robert Sargent. How do we motivate big box change to sell and promote the planting of native trees and shrubs that benefit invertebrate and vertebrate communities such as butterflies and birds, air quality, shade, beauty, health, recreation, etc.?
Yes, I mean, so that's a big question. I think there are three ways. One is through education, the kind of making people aware, so that individual choices, when people go to the store, will be more directed into towards native plants. The second is the combined effect of all of that produces an economic pressure to provide more natives and to label them and advertise them within the store. And then the third, I think there is a role for regulation or incentives. We know very well that our lives depend on a thriving indigenous community of trees. And so I think there's a role for encouraging that. And also, we know there are species that are extremely damaging to ecosystems and also to the human economy. And those invasive species should, I think, be barred from sale because we can quantify the economic and ecological damage of them.
That's all the time that we have for Q&A right now. Would you be willing to stick around with us a little bit? I know that we have some discussions after our program, and
Yes.
it would be great to have you in our treehouse to be a part
I'll
of
be
that
there.
conversation.
I look forward to seeing everyone there.
Excellent. Thanks for being
Thank
here. And I think we might have sold some of your books here because I heard a lot of folks that both have read both The Forest Unseen and The Song for Trees. I also saw in the chat a number of other books that were highlighted as well. Lots of great reading for folks as they're spending more time at home.
Wonderful. Thank you. It's a delight to be with everyone.
Excellent.